Hi there, welcome to today's excursion. I'm Rob Poyton of the Innsmouth Book Club, and today I'm back on home territory. I'm in North Bedfordshire at the village of Ravensden. Apologies first of all for the long gap between this and our previous excursion down in Devon. Obviously at this time of year the weather is not too conducive to outdoor filming, and I've also been busy editing the 4th Innsmouth Gold anthology. That's out now, that's available via Amazon or direct, and that's a great new anthology centered around the mythos of the King in Yellow. So that's 13 new stories based around the Robert Chambers mythos. If you're into the King in Yellow and cosmic horror, then I think you'll really enjoy that new book, and we'll put a link up to it in the notes below. So here we are in Ravensden, Ravensden, and a name doesn't get much more Viking or Dane than that. And as we've mentioned before on these local excursions, this area was the front line for a long time between the Anglo-Saxons and the invading Danes coming across from the coast. So the Danes had a big camp established at Tempsford, just down the road, just outside of St Neots. And it is said a group from Tempsford travelled to this area and built a camp up on the hill behind me. Ravensden sits on top of this hill. It's the highest ground in the area, so obviously this is a good spot for them to pitch their camp at. And they called the area Ravensden or Ravens Valley. And they were probably one of the groups of Danes who attacked Bedford in 1010. They actually went into Bedford, raided it and burned it to the ground. Now Ravensden is quite spread out as a village, so we're going to be travelling around a little bit because there's a few really good stories here and some great history. In fact, we're going to be looking at some quite old stories, some modern ones, and then we're going to finish at a site that is going to take us way back in time. There's also a couple of local landmarks I'd just like to quickly mention. We have the water tower. Now that's a 150-foot tall water tower that was built in the 1950s, and that is highly visible for miles around. It's a very prominent local landmark. It always puts me in mind of Saruman's Tower, Allthank from the Lord of the Rings every time I go past it. The second famous landmark here is a house called the Grange or Little Grange. This was a billet for officers of the US Air Force during the Second World War. Of course, there's a big US airfield at Thurley and a few others around the area. And this is said to be the place where Glenn Miller gave his last public performance before he took off from Twinwoods, just down the road as well, on that fateful last flight. So a couple of quite local landmarks and a little bit of history already, but we're going to go first of all to the site of Ravensden's most famous haunting. So it's a summer's evening in 1873, and we're on a stretch of road between Ravensden and Wilden, and it was along this that a Mrs. Goodall and her daughter were riding along in a pony carriage when they saw a strange figure approaching along the verge. This figure was described as being dressed completely in black, and the clothing was described as flowing or trailing behind the figure as it glided along the verge here. As it came level with the carriage, both Mrs. Goodall and her daughter looked to the left to see who this person was, and they were shocked by a face that gave them a malevolent glare. Indeed, Mrs. Goodall could only describe it as fiendish. This obviously gave them a bit of a jolt, but when they looked round again to see where the figure had gone, obviously walking down the verge here, it had disappeared from sight. It absolutely vanished. Now, Mrs. Goodall made inquiries about this with locals, and they informed her that this stretch of road had long had a history of haunting by this particular strange figure. We then jump forward 100 years to 1973, when Andrew Green, who's a local investigator, stopped off at the pub just up the road here, and while he was there he got chatting to some locals and the subject of ghosts come up, and one of the locals in the pub also recounted this same experience of having been travelling along this stretch of road and seeing this figure come gliding along the verge, and again the face was described as ghastly. I think the guy said something like, literally, if looks could kill, I would have been dead. Pure malevolence. And this sighting is not a nighttime one, interestingly enough, but all of the sightings reported have been during daylight hours. The suggestion is that this apparition is that of Mother Sutton, who was a well-known local witch in the 17th century. And I use witch in inverted commas there, obviously, because we know the sort of things that happened at the time. In fact, Mother Sutton and her daughter, who lived at Milton Ernest, the next village along, were both arrested in 1612, and they were both put to the test of floating. So their hands and feet were bound together and they were dropped in the local river. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank and died and drowned, they were innocent. So from there they were both tortured and beaten and put in Bedford jail. And on the 30th of March 1612 they were both hung as witches. So this was one of the first cases of what we might call the witch craze or hysteria that took hold of England at the time. And of course that led to the persecution, torture and execution of so many innocent people. One interesting thing about the Mother Sutton case is that this was the first example of a person being tried by floating, by the water method. And the next year there was a pamphlet published about the case that was called Witches Apprehended, Examined and Executed. And from that pamphlet being published, that method of floating started to spread far and wide. So not only a horrible end for Mother Sutton and her daughter, but also the start and spread of a practice that no doubt sealed the fate of many other poor people as well. So we mentioned a pub in our first story. There should always be a pub in a good ghost story. And our second story actually involves two pubs. These are down at the bottom of the hill in the village. And the pubs are the Old White Lion and the Blacksmith's Arms. The Old White Lion you can see behind me, and the Blacksmith's Arms was the building opposite. Neither of them are used as pubs anymore. The Old White Lion was converted into a listed cottage in the 1940s, and the Blacksmith's Arms was last used as an Indian restaurant, but the building was since demolished and now there's a row of new houses there. The Old White Lion was built in the 1820s, and as we said, it was converted into a cottage which was bought by a couple, and the couple came to visit the cottage before moving in a few times, and the lady of the couple, whose name was Helen, on one visit picked a single pink rose from a bush in the garden. Helen was given a job interview a few months later, and things got rather strange when the lady she was interviewing said to her, "I can see the spirit of a woman standing behind you." It's not something I've ever experienced at a job interview, I have to say. Furthermore, this woman, or the spirit of this woman, said she lived in Helen's cottage. The interviewee went on to describe the interior of the cottage in quite some detail, including a photograph that was hanging in the wall on the cottage that was a picture of the Peacock family, who were landlords when the building used to be a pub. And the interviewer said that this woman wanted to give Helen a pink rose. And the story now goes that on the 22nd of May, which was Elizabeth Peacock's birthday, so the implication is that the spirit of this woman was Elizabeth Peacock, on the 22nd of May every year, the bush in the garden produces a single pink rose. And Elizabeth Peacock died in 1881. So that's quite a contrast to our first story of terror and malevolence. This seems quite a benevolent and friendly spirit. Now, the Blacksmith's Arms opposite, the story there is a little more conventional perhaps. For many years people reported banging doors and strange sounds and the feeling of a presence. In 2004, when it was still a pub, a local paranormal investigation group went in and they recorded lots of thuds, strange lights, and I think all of the team experienced temperature drops in several areas of the pub. Obviously that building is no longer there, so in a sense I guess that haunting has been lost to history, or certainly lost to developers. So our final story takes us right to the edge of the village, right out along the Thurley Road to a spot called Wood End, just in front of me there. and from Wood End runs this narrow sort of single lane track that you can see behind me. This is called Grays Hill, and it runs all the way along a ridge right round and then joins up back with the main road. And so from this you really get a good view over Bedford. Now we can't get all the way down the lane because there's a big building project. We mentioned developers already once. Well, there's 165 new houses going in at the end of the lane now. They'll have a lovely view over Bedford, of course, but it does somewhat inhibit our means of getting from here right down back to the main road again. Nonetheless, Grays Hill is the scene of several sightings of a ghostly coach and horses. They were said to be seen riding from Wood End along Grays Hill. Now the story gets a little bit confused, and there's been some investigations done, because the initial story said that this ghostly coach and 4 horses travelled from Wood End to Throw's End Farm and then to a manor house that had the remains of a moat that could still be seen around it. But after investigating, this seems a little bit odd because there's no place called Throw's End Farm around here. Some people say there is or was a Trousfield farm, which may be Outfield's farm, just round the bend there now. Possibly that's the same place. There is an old manor house near here, but that's in the opposite direction to Wood End, and it has no moat. But if we could pop out at the other end of Grays Hill, what we'd find is from there's a small road called Cleat Hill, and that leads us to a site that perfectly fits the description of an old manor house with an existing moat. So that's our very old site, and that's where we're going to head to now to finish today's excursion. So imagine our ghostly coach and 4 horses, if you will, leaving from Wood End, coming along the top of the ridge there along Grays Hill. They come down and along the road here, which is now the B660, and literally within a couple of 100 yards you arrive at this site, Mowsbury Hill Fort. This is the very old place I told you about, because in the 70s archaeological digs here uncovered evidence, pottery and such like, dating back to the Iron Age. They also found some Roman era pottery, and in medieval times there was a manor house built here, and the manor house had a moat. In fact, you can still see the moat today. So that then ties our story in very nicely of travelling from Wood End to the moated manor house. This is a single rampart hill fort, what's known as a univalate. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's one of 10 in Bedfordshire. And as you can see again from the view, we're very high up just to the north of town. You get a panoramic view across the whole of Bedford below. So when the place was investigated in the 70s, it was found to have a single ditch which was about 15 feet wide and 6 foot deep, leading up onto the higher ground, onto the mound. There were traces of what were possibly a hut circle on top of the mound, and as I said, there were fragments of Iron Age and Roman pottery discovered. Now in medieval times, this area was also put to use as the site of a manor house owned by the Morin family. So the area became known as Morinsbury, Morin's Castle. This was a manor house that had a moat, and they obviously utilised part of the existing earthworks, part of the existing moat. They also adapted those existing earthworks, the moat in particular, to build fish ponds, which would have been a good supply of food for them. So although it wasn't a castle as such, it certainly would have been a fortified manor house, I gather. They had this moat already, adapted from the existing ditch. Access across it was by a single wooden bridge, and given its height and location and the steepness of the hill that we're on, plus the bank on top, it would have been a place that was quite easily defended. So that was the Morin family. The earliest records indicate the landowner as being a Ralph Morin. So Morinsbury, Morin's Castle, as we said, that became Moresbury, and that eventually became Mowsbury. So today it's Mowsbury Iron Age Hill Fort, and there's also now it's surrounded by a rather large golf course, Mowsbury Golf Course, and there's also quite a nice park just over the back as well. So the site now is very well preserved. It's looked after by the Friends of Putlow Wood and Mowsbury Hill Fort, and we'll put a link up to their site in the notes below. It's, as I say, it's well looked after and maintained, but it's largely undisturbed as well. I'm not sure that apart from the 1970s there's been any major archaeological digs sort of going on here. Also, I'm not aware of any particular ghost stories or haunting or any paranormal events reported from this site. You would think with the age of it there might be something, but if you have heard of something, if you are local to the area or you have heard something along those lines, then please do get in touch and let me know. And again, this is one of those places that I've lived in the area for 15 years. I'm literally sort of 2 miles just down the road, and until I think last year I'd never ever heard of it. It's very tucked away behind the golf course. You see the golf course, but you don't know that this place is behind. There's no signs out on the road or anything else. So it was almost by chance I discovered this, and what a fascinating and interesting site it is. So there we go. I hope you've enjoyed today's excursion to Ravensden. Again, it fascinates me that within one village we've got stories dating from the 21st century, the 20th century, the 19th century, and then all the way back to the Iron Age. There's such an incredible amount of history in all these small little places across the country. If you do have any more information about any of the sites we've seen today or any other good stories from Ravensden, please do let me know. Likewise, if you have any interesting sites in your area that you'd like me to come and make an excursion to, then also let me know as well. If they're within striking distance, I'll do my best to get there. So thanks again for watching. Please do like, share and subscribe, and remember as well to check out the Innsmouth Book Club podcast, where every fortnight we take a trip into Innsmouth to discuss weird fiction, weird film, poetry, music, gaming, comics, and also have interviews with some very interesting people. Until next time, I'll be seeing you.